and welcome to Rising. We have a fantastic show for you today. I'm joined by Batya Ungar-Sargon. Lovely to see you, Batya.
It's so great to be here with you, Robby.
Well, why don't you start us off?
Yes, indeed. Well, Robby, the House Select Subcommittee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government is holding hearings on Capitol Hill this morning. Today's hearing will focus on Louisiana and Missouri's lawsuit against President Biden. That suit accuses the White House of colluding with major social media companies to flag and censor content related to COVID and elections.
The Attorney General of Louisiana, Jeff Landry, testified about his findings in the case. Let's watch some of that.
A lawsuit has uncovered a censorship enterprise that spans numerous government institutions and all major social media platforms. And that censorship enterprise has been widely successful in achieving its goals. White House Director of Digital Strategy, Robert Flattery, was impressed when YouTube reported their success in reducing watch time of borderline content by 70%. This is what we found in our case. The FBI claims a success rate of 50% in getting platforms to censor content flagged as misinformation. The Election Integrity Partnership, now known as the Virality Project, bragged that 4 major platforms they worked with all had high response rates and that 35% of URLs shared with Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube were either labeled, removed, or soft blocked.
But not before he was interrupted by U.S. Virgin Islands delegate Stacy Plaskett following an outbreak of chaos in the hearing floor. Take a look.
And scientists and journalists throughout was shadow banned, had censored, a lot of damage on other federal buildings for their valid concerns. So I would like to submit that letter for the record. COVID vaccines. And everyone, that violence throughout that past year had inflicted a lot of damage on other federal buildings as well. And so I would like to submit that letter for the record.
That's not a correction.
Gentlelady's out of order.
That's not a correction. I said he refused to join the 50 other attorneys.
General Lady has not been recognized. Time belongs to the Attorney General from the state of Louisiana. Mr. Landry, you can proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm grateful for the opportunity to join Congress today.
The Democratic witness, a fellow at the Constitutional Law Center at Stanford Law School, Matt Seligman, had this to say in his testimony. Let's watch.
Attacking those platforms attempts to combat misinformation, the plaintiffs in cases like Missouri v. Biden do disservice to the principles of free speech that they claim to support, and they invite the grave consequences of misinformation that they seek to spread themselves unchecked. It is perhaps not a coincidence that the proponents of measures that would handicap social media platforms' efforts to combat misinformation are often prolific purveyors of misinformation themselves. Senator Schmidt and Attorney General Landry, who just testified, filed a brief in the Supreme Court supporting a suit by the state of Texas seeking to block the counting of electoral votes from 4 states that President Biden won. Over 100 members of Congress, including members of this committee today, also filed briefs supporting that suit. Texas's complaint included a fantastical claim that the statistical likelihood that President Biden fairly won the 2020 election was less than 1 in quadrillion. That is false. Members of this committee have claimed that Dominion voting machines fraudulently flipped votes from Trump to Biden. That is false. Members of this committee have claimed that thousands of ballots were cast on behalf of dead and unqualified voters. That is false. Members of this committee have claimed that election workers around the country counted fake or fraudulent votes. That is false. And on October 19th, 2020, Chairman Jordan tweeted that Democrats are trying to steal the election after the election.
So
I just think that's such a non sequitur,
Right.
right? I mean, what, right? Is that what you, I mean, like what?
Yeah.
So a person who has disagreed with you minimally and let's say even said something that turned out to be misinformation maximally, therefore has no right to point out when actual censorship is happening. I mean, how does that make any sense?
Right. So I followed this case pretty closely. My own reporting, the Facebook files about the CDC's efforts to pressure that social media company into taking down COVID-related so-called misinformation, any content that could theoretically cause people to question whether to get vaccinated. That whole effort comes as a result of this lawsuit. I worked with the new Civil Liberties Alliance, which is a civil liberties organization that's helping with the suit, and they made these emails accessible to me. These emails that showed a routine level of communication between the Centers for Disease Control and moderators at all sorts of social media companies, but Facebook in particular, to address claims that they thought were false. And a lot of those claims, I do personally think they were false. But the basis eventually for doing it was not just to prevent falsehood, but they were worried about the harm that could result from people being discouraged about vaccines, even for children by the end. And this was coming at a time, obviously, that the Biden administration, the Biden White House, was saying things like, Facebook is killing people because it's leaving up too much information. What are they, if they're not going to do something about this, we'll make them do something about this. We'll punish them, we'll hurt the company, that kind of thing. That's the influence campaign we're talking about here. I think it's totally wrong. It was totally inappropriate. It chilled the discussion around these topics, and there are all sorts of things that you couldn't talk about on Facebook that are now we broadly recognize that was a very stupid way to conduct the discourse. You could not mention lab leak on Facebook for a full year. They would take it down. And now that looks, even more idiotic than it looked at the time.
Right. So I think there's two issues here. First of all, there are things that we now accept as true, that if you posted them at the time, it would get taken down. You could have your account banned and so forth. OK, everybody saw that happen. Everybody knows that happened. And the Democrats, rather than acknowledge that it happened because they got things wrong, instead, what you're going to see is over and over and over what you have seen, what you just saw right now, what you saw when Matt Taibbi and Michael Schellenberger were being grilled. You're going to see logical fallacy after logical fallacy. You're going to see ad hominem attacks, right? Assassination of character. You're going to see non sequiturs. You're going to see them insulting people as a way of distracting from the fact that we all know is true, that in order to push their agenda, they completely censored information, much of which we now know to be true. Now, you could say that at the time, right, there were two competing sets of needs, right? The most generous interpretation, I'm so curious what you think of this argument, Robby, is that the Biden administration truly believed what Dr. Fauci was saying, which was that, you leave this stuff up at your peril, millions of people will die. We have to take it down to protect people, right? So the most generous reading is that they truly believed that they were saving lives and that somehow excused these, infringements on, our rights. Now, but even if they believed that then, in the most generous terms, we know now that was wrong, right? We know now that a lot of the stuff that got taken down in the name of saving lives actually turned out to be what they thought was true at the time, we now know is not true. So they have to admit that, right? I mean, I could understand, like, at the time saying, like, look, there's we really believed we were saving lives, but now they need to say, and we were wrong and we're sorry, right? And instead, all they do is say, but you peddle misinformation on this totally other topic, and therefore you don't deserve to have a say on this thing that we obviously got wrong.
Yeah, I mean, it's a classic kind of philosophical argument against free speech to say, well, free speech is dangerous because, what if you say something wrong and it causes somebody to get hurt? well, this is why you can't operate that way, because what is true? How do we know that would be the right thing to do? Because the idea of free speech is that you need to let everybody speak and make their case and their argument for what they think, and then hopefully informed people will choose the right thing. They won't always choose the right thing, but more often than not, under that system, you allow truth to arise and people to follow it or learn from it. And in exactly this case, they tried to stop you from maligning the vaccine, particularly along the lines of not reducing case counts. They wanted the public health apparatus wanted to push vaccination on everyone, and then even have some intellectual support for requiring it on people in a variety of contexts. Certain employees, et cetera, are going to be made to get the jab, millions of them, on a basis that this is how we would contain the spread of COVID. And then it turned out, lo and behold, which some people were saying all along was going to be the case, that the vaccine was not, while it's protective against severe disease and death, particularly for people who've not had COVID, the elderly, immunocompromised, it cannot stem the cases themselves. It's not protective enough against infection. That was the central incorrect idea of the whole thing, and that was the argument for was for requiring it, was really on, well, we can require it because if you don't get it, you could more easily spread it to a lot of other people. So this is how we contain the pandemic. That turned out to be substantially untrue. And you're right. They should just admit it, and they should say we're sorry, and they should think. They should think twice next time whether it will be justified to have some vast restriction of speech. But of course, they're not going to do that. Of course, they'll never admit that they were wrong to have a vast restriction of speech, which is why these hearings are so important. And that ultimately, the action, I think, that needs to come from it is to put in check the government agencies communicating with the platforms, telling them to take down speech. Because at the end of the day, it's very hard to control what the platforms do themselves of their own volition. But we certainly don't need to be encouraging them and the government, at the behest of the government, to do more censorship. That's where the reining in really needs to take place, and I hope there's actual legislation that comes out of these hearings, again, to constrain the government itself.
100%. And, we're going to talk about TikTok later, but it's relevant here, right? One of the arguments against banning TikTok has been, well, all of these other social media companies are so deeply embedded with the deep state that we don't want to have a similar thing happen, right? We don't want more government involvement in social media companies, which would happen as a result of a ban. But TikTok, it's a Chinese company, right? We cannot haul the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, in front of the Senate, in front of Congress, right? And demand answers the way that our elected officials are doing right now. I mean, we could bring the CEO in, right? But what does that help us? We saw last week, it doesn't get you very far, right? That what we're seeing here is our checks and balances working. We're seeing our elected officials standing up and saying, look, something happened here that was unconstitutional, and we're going to get to the bottom of it. And that is extremely important.
We will indeed talk about TikTok in a little bit, and we'll have more Rising right after this.